In order to maintain the biodiversity on planet Earth, we need to understand very well how humans reduce that biodiversity and prevent those reductions from taking place. So, first off, humans reduce biodiversity most often by destroying the habitat that those organisms require to survive. They also sometimes eliminate keystone species that are inside an ecosystem, and when they are eliminated, it causes a ripple effect through the rest of the ecosystem, and the biodiversity of that ecosystem is reduced disproportionately to what you might think. Thirdly, humans sometimes introduce invasive species from elsewhere on the planet, and when those invasive species get there, they take over a particular area, and in doing so reduce the biodiversity. And then lastly, but certainly not least, there are larger scale and environmental problems that humans cause, such as global warming and pollution, that greatly reduce biodiversity. So let's start with the first one, habitat destruction. So right here you can see, well, you could have seen, a rainforest that has now been deforested, and there's only a little sliver right in the middle of remaining rainforest in this area. Now, obviously, there are plenty of organisms, and with them plenty of species that have been eliminated from this area, so the biodiversity has already gone down. And the organisms living in that fragmented environment are going to have a lot of trouble getting the resources that they need, in particular finding a mate, and some organisms are probably on their way out because all the resources that they require to survive have been destroyed. So habitat destruction is a surefire way to greatly reduce the biodiversity in an area. Another way humans greatly reduce biodiversity is by eliminating very important species in an ecosystem. These species are called keystone species, and if you were to think of an ecosystem as though it were a building, the keystone is a stone that's placed just such that if you were to take it out, the rest of the building would collapse. Keystone species function in much the same way, so that if a keystone species is harmed in an ecosystem, the rest of the ecosystem comes crumbling down around it. And in a coral reef, that keystone species is, yes, you guessed it, the coral. Now, you might think that coral is just a funny-shaped rock, but at night, or when you're not looking, there are actually coral polyps that live inside that rock that stick their little tentacles out and try to pluck food particles out of the water column. As they eat these food particles, they make more of a skeleton, and that skeleton is what grows into the hard piece of coral that you may have held, or you can definitely see a lot of in this picture. Now, one problematic thing that can happen to coral is called coral bleaching. That is, the surface temperatures in that area of the ocean rise such that the coral dies. And when the coral dies, the rest of the ecosystem cannot be supported. And the biodiversity, as you probably guessed, goes way, way down. Now, what if we humans were to introduce a new species to an area? We could call it an alien species if it comes from a different geographic area, and humans were the ones who brought it into this new ecosystem. There are some alien species that they do, in fact, increase the biodiversity of ecosystems. So you could take Queen Anne's lace, which you could find in your backyard, similarly red clover, which you have probably seen. These are two once European, now American species of plants that you can find in our backyards, and generally they don't decrease biodiversity. In some cases, they even increase the biodiversity as there are yet one more species present. But sometimes when humans move species around, the effect is much worse. Let's go back to our healthy wetland as an example. When humans introduced the species purple loosestrife, which is more than an alien, it's in fact called an invasive species. These invasive species are so good at living in this new ecosystem that they actually push out plenty of other species, and so you can see the biodiversity in this ecosystem going way, way down. Finally, after time passes, the entire ecosystem is greatly reduced in biodiversity. Now, invasive species can reduce biodiversity in three major ways. First is by consuming or eating native species. They can also outcompete native species. And then lastly, they can change the environment in an area and make it inhospitable for native species. Those native species can no longer survive there. So let's take a look at some invasive species that consume natives. So Japanese beetles are a perfect example of this. You can picture one Japanese beetle with its hook-like claws was able to grab onto a traveler and hitch a ride on a boat until it came over to the U.S., and ba-bam, now suddenly there's plenty of food for it to eat and not a lot of predators to eat it. And so these Japanese beetles greatly reduce biodiversity in the areas where they flourish. Similarly, Asian longhorn beetles, quite the same story, and you may have seen ads in the tea like this one that actually ask and this is the Massachusetts government right here saying that, well, if you see a beetle that looks like this, or you see an exit hole in a log that looks like this, then please call this number so that you can notify us and we can track down these beetles and make sure that they do not spread. Invasive species also outcompete native species. Oriental bittersweet is a perfect example of this. This lovely-looking plant with its pretty berries, often used as an ornamental decoration in the middle of a Thanksgiving table, and when a family was done with its Thanksgiving dinner, it would take the Oriental bittersweet and throw it in the backyard. Now, fast forward 10 years, and suddenly the backyard looks something like this, and you've got Oriental bittersweet that's competing for sunlight and nutrients in the soil, so much so that it actually tears down trees. And so obviously if it's taking down trees and covering up the ground in that particular area, then the biodiversity is being greatly reduced. And then lastly, and purple loosestrife is an example of this, there are invasive species that change an environment and make it uninhabitable for native species. So even though this purple loosestrife might look very beautiful on this wetland, there's only one species. Because that purple loosestrife has pulled up all the water out of the ground and is competing for all of that sunlight, there's no room for other species, and that means that the biodiversity is yet again greatly reduced. Briefly, I wanted to mention some invasive species that you may already be familiar with just walking around in your own backyards. Right here you have some Japanese knotweed, which has these pretty white flowers and these very distinct bamboo-like stalks. You've also got glossy buckthorn, which has shiny leaves and red-black berries. You also have this plant right here called Phragmites that often grows in wetlands like purple loosestrife and takes them over. All perhaps beautiful plants, but don't be fooled. They are invasive and they greatly reduce biodiversity in the areas where they grow. Lastly, we have to consider the large-scale changes that humans have caused in our biosphere. Amongst these global environmental issues are global warming and pollution. For each of these, there are countless examples of species that have gone extinct because of these large-scale changes. And so when we think about maintaining biodiversity on this planet, we can't just think about stopping habitat destruction, stopping keystone species destruction, limiting invasive species. We also have to think about the biggest, most prominent problems, global warming and pollution, and how they are negatively affecting biodiversity. So in conclusion, why is it that we care about biodiversity so much? Well, first off, organisms are awesome. Second of all, biodiversity can help us make important medical, architectural, and engineering advances. And then lastly, we depend on biologically diverse ecosystems for food, oxygen, and a place to live. So it's of the utmost importance that we maintain biodiversity. And some ways that we can save it are to preserve habitats and keystone species, to protect endangered species, to stop the introduction and spread of invasive species, and to reduce pollution and global warming on this planet. And the sooner we realize how important biodiversity is, how inextricable our lives and our survival are with biodiversity, the sooner we will be on the path to maintaining it.